game where he's like sub 1% owned.
Yeah, I mean that's Red Pack for it. He knows everything. Hello, everyone. It is time for a little late slate swap and sweat. Damn it, I think I said it backwards. I didn't mess up the words themselves, though, so we got to take the little victories where we can get them. I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man who just woke up from a little Betty bye, went to sleep thinking Facundo Campazzo was the chalk bust of the day, and now, Greg, do you know we live in a Campazzo world? It's Nerd Ask Greg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, totally. Campazzo smashed as he scored all his fantasy points while I was napping tonight. That was fantastic. It was really funny because this is the third show I'm doing today, and I ate food. I hadn't eaten really much today either, so I ate a little bit, tried to recharge, take a quick nap, and when I went to take a nap, Campazzo had, I think it was 1 assist and no other stats, and I just tweeted about it, and everybody was complaining about how much he sucked, and I woke up, it's like, oh, he's the best player on the slate now.
Yeah, I went to walk my dogs, and we're going to talk, as we always do, in the late slate sweat and swap on this show, that we're going to kind of tilt a little bit about what's going on in the main slate, reflect on it in the moment here. Then normally we'll talk a little more about swaptimizing. I think today we may talk kind of generally about it, since it's been a popular topic of conversation recently, as pretty much every lineup yesterday was a late swap to the top of the tournaments on DraftKings and FanDuel. But, let's open up and I think get mad at the things we want to get mad about. So let us know in the chat what's got you upset about the early parts of the slate. Some chalk plays already busted. JaMychal Green, a guy that Terry and I nickel and dimed on Live Before Lock, and sort of came out that we didn't love him that much, ended up being one of the biggest busts of the day. Michael Porter Jr. is the one I'm going to get mad about, but you guys tell us in the chat or wherever else, tweet us, I don't know, but hit the like button, tell us things that make you mad. And Greg, I have to say the one thing, I'll actually, rather than what makes me mad, Michael Porter Jr. is a guy that makes me mad, but Campazzo going off, I think, was really interesting because I had finished the show, went to walk my dogs, watched, I think, most of the first half of that game. And then as I'm walking my dogs, I'm like, oh, Campazzo's got 8 points. And then all of a sudden it just goes downhill from there, or really uphill for, I guess, depending upon the positive version of that. I felt good about Campazzo. I feel like this is the first chalk play where I'm like, yeah, good. Everybody played him. We all won. I think it's a nice day for Campazzo lovers.
Yeah. So how heavy were you on Campazzo today? I have him
98% Campazzo.
98%. Okay. So I played primarily on FanDuel, and I had him in 39% of my FanDuel lineup. So in hindsight, I wish I would have had him more. That's still overweight to the field because of the pricing difference. He was 3,500 on FanDuel, but he ended up being, I think he was like 30% owned. So slightly overweight. But ultimately I built my lineups as like, I don't want this much Campazzo in my lineups on FanDuel. There's less positional flexibility. So I nerfed him a little bit to get to 39%. Then in hindsight, it's like, oh, I wish I would have had more Campazzo so that I could have had, I guess, bad players at other positions in my lineups. This is a really weird slate for chalk busting because, I mean, the two highest owned players on FanDuel tonight are Michael Porter Jr., who was terrible and didn't even really play much in the second half, and then JaMychal Green, who was equally terrible. He got to play a little bit more minutes, but it just didn't matter because he didn't do anything with him. He just kind of ran around the court, got some cardio, got some rebounds, missed some layups. That kind of seemed like his deal tonight.
Yeah, Porter, I think, is the play that Campazzo, it's sort of a situation with Campazzo that normally these guys here who come into the lineup and really don't have a ton of usage, don't do enough, overall in terms of fantasy point per minute. I'm going to pull up Denver's stats here just to see where it kind of landed. But yeah, only a 15.5% usage rate for Campazzo, 17.5% assist rate. I think boded pretty well in the spot for Boston, but he just kind of did a little bit of everything. And that's something that I think we talked about it a couple slates ago, the idea of, usage rate. And there was somebody in the chat who was like, oh yeah, usage rate is such a stupid stat. Like who would want that? And somebody actually had said, I think in the premium Slack, like usage rate is very important for stars, especially in the minutes are key for a role player. And Campazzo at 3,300 being a role player who does a little bit of everything, I think maybe is a reason why he was more appealing than a guy like JaMychal Green, who vocalized his concerns on Live Before Lock, but him coming into the starting lineup, losing some rebounds, losing some possessions that he normally has in a second unit. There's probably a lesson to learn in there, Greg. I don't know what it is, but there's probably one somewhere in there.
Yeah, well, I mean, the larger point, too, is so when I was doing the tip-off show earlier in the day and we were talking about some of the potential value plays at that point in time, that was also different. Monty Morse was still in at that point. We didn't know whether he was going to be playing or not, so Campazzo was a potential option, except it was also somebody like, I didn't know that Campazzo was going to start when Monty Morse was questionable. I was like, it could be Ken Carr that starts. It could be, it was just a bunch of who's who of players that nobody had really heard of that were potentially going to move into the Nuggets starting lineup. But we talked about JaMychal Green as a value play. One thing that I said when I was looking, I was like, he's not even playing well off the bench. Like if you look at his fantasy production over the last month or so, and by the way, the same thing's gone for Michael Porter too. These are guys who, even when they've been on the court, they haven't produced particularly well. So, I mean, that was definitely a concern for JaMychal Green. Don't get me wrong. I have exposure to him tonight. And Michael Porter, I didn't even like Michael Porter Jr. And he ended up in like half my lineups on FanDuel because I couldn't get off him at his price point. And that's probably what's really the most triggering thing to me about Michael Porter Jr. is when you have a play and I just keep rerunning my lineups. And no matter how much I lower his projection, he just keeps appearing in lineups. Eventually, I just give up. And it's like, all right, I'm going to get to some Michael Porter Jr. It is what it is. And then he just has a total floor game and just sucks as hard as he possibly can. He goes 0 of 8 from the field, doesn't make his shots, doesn't get to play in the fourth quarter because of how much he sucked the rest of the game. So, yeah, I mean, Michael Porter Jr., who also, he's literally had one good game over the last month since coming back from COVID. And I don't know if that's a coincidence or maybe that impacted him in some way, but he's been really terrible for a little while now.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, the Nuggets have always had a situation with them that they want to get away from Michael Porter, or they have found ways to get away from him time and time and again. But you would think with JaMychal Green starting alongside him, with Paul Millsap out, with Barton also out, guys who normally could take minutes away, PJ Dozier still out. Like, it's like they're creating guys just to take minutes away from Porter, with Zeke Nnaji now being out there for a ton of run, didn't do much with it. But it's just funny, like some players, some coaches and the player, it's just they always want to, whatever, be a motivational tactic or just frustration. And it seems like that's always going to be the case with Malone and Porter, that he just wants to find a way to get him off the floor.
Yeah, and part of it too is because there aren't that many players who, I mean, realistically, Michael Porter Jr., I still think he's a good prospect and somebody who is probably one of the more valuable young trade pieces in the league. But there's still a point that he's only viable on one end of the court. Like he's just a total void on defense. And so you get into certain game situations, like we saw a ton in the playoffs last year. The Jazz just ran him off the court. They just ran pick and rolls at Michael Porter Jr. at will. And there were certain situations where when they couldn't play Michael Porter, he had to come off the court because it was just free baskets for the Jazz on offense by just attacking Michael Porter Jr. in the pick and roll. And then we talk about a game where he's 0 of 8 from the field, that he's not hitting shots. It's like, what's the value of having him out on the court? So that's one of the main reasons that we just see so much variance in his playing time.
There was one shot where that Nnaji had from the corner where he was wide open. And I was just like, this is a shot Porter makes. And especially when you're behind and down 12 points, and they kind of called off the dogs early too in that game against Boston, but just a weird situation for Denver. And Porter, I'm sure, is going to have better days. I think for the most part, buying in on these guys, I think when they are down is still going to be the plus EV approach, but maybe not having as much of Porter as I had, where 80% of my lineups will be dying on the vine because of Ola MPJ and his vaccine hatred, I guess.
and the other thing with Porter too is, if it was like earlier in the day when I was looking at the slate, I was like, I really like Michael Porter, because it's hard to know what the ownership's going to be early in the slate. So when I'm just looking at like projections and what I think players are going to perform, and like I always talk about historical pricing for players, I was like, I'm going to love Michael Porter tonight. And then the ownership comes out for the slate. It's like, oh, well, now we have Michael Porter projected for 45% ownership. I don't like him nearly that much at that kind of ownership. But it was, like I said, it was still kind of hard to get off him, at least on FanDuel.
So Righteous King right away, cutting through all the noise. Campazzo asks, stop bigging up these international players because y'all personally like them. To be clear, I have no opinion about Campazzo before today, other than like, oh, I knew he was Argentinian. I thought I liked his name because it sounded Italian. That was about as deep as it went for me. And it's probably less deep than I had for Ben DiNucci. But of all nights to be like, oh, he's ass, you're hyping him up. How about the night that he has, like, he assists, he's getting steals, he's very active, looking kind of JJ Barea adjacent. Like, this is not the night to be like, oh, don't talk about this guy, he's ass. Like, he was the best fantasy play of the day.
Yeah, he's 3,300 on DraftKings, scored 37 fantasy points. And then on FanDuel, he was 3,500 and scored 38 fantasy points. So, I mean, yeah, like, what are we going to say? We're going to come on and be like, first of all, we have an hour to kill for a one-game slate. Like, what are we going to come on here and be like, boy, Campazzo really sucked tonight, huh? I mean, we can't say that either, because it wouldn't be true. Like, we're just supposed to bury this guy who we didn't really ever think about. I haven't thought about Campazzo once for a slate this entire season until now.
Yeah, I think that's the nature of the beast here. And that's why we play DFS, is you get to learn about these guys a little more. And honestly, sometimes that Charles Barkley segment where he has to name guys on teams, and then it's like super obvious guys, not even the Campazzos of the world. It's like, oh, I mean, I guess this is going to make me sound like a basketball nerd, but Garrett Temple, like for us, that's an obvious one. We're like, yeah, we talk about him all the time on the Bulls, and now he screws over Denzel Valentine. And that's just, it doesn't mean you like the guys. It just means it's all night to night. And also no player is washed. It's all relative to salaries, and Campazzo coming coming into life here as a fun thing. JaMychal Green, not so much. Let's talk about anything else, actually, Greg, on the main slate, because we can talk a little bit about Swaptimizer. We only have one game here today, as Greg mentioned up top. We got that Brooklyn Nets game. No Kyrie Irving, no Kevin Durant for that one. The Suns on the other side. Total in this game, not fantastic. We'll get to more of the details because it's just a showdown. We're not going to have to belabor things too much. Drop any sort of chats you have into YouTube or the premium Slack. And again, hit that like button for us. If we get enough likes, I don't know what enough likes would be, but just an amount that feels good to me. I'll give you guys some of the top 5 owned plays for the Showdown slate, because why not? But you can always get that data yourself at awesemo.com/join. Anything else on the main slate for you, Greg, that's worth hitting on? I feel like Milwaukee, people had some hopes here. Pat Connaughton putting up a day of all points and blocks to break the slate, I guess, for 1% of owned lineups. But anything else interesting to you that you saw tonight?
Well, Kyle Lowry just got injured. He's out for the rest of the game. That is something of note. I was checking to see if we had a net starting lineup, because in terms of swapping to players, I assume that most people's lineup spots are full at this point, especially because Campazzo was so highly owned on DraftKings. Not so much on FanDuel, except it's going to be hard to make swaps on FanDuel anyway. But he's so popular on DraftKings. I don't even know how many viable swaps there are going to be to talk about, unless something totally wild happens with the Nets lineup in this game. But I mean, for me, I'm looking to see what cheap players potentially make it into the Nets starting line. I have no expectation for what starting 5 they're going to roll out.
Yeah, I think you'd have to assume we're going to see DeAndre Jordan. Also, I'm noticing now one of my lineups is now in 28th on the finger roll, which is the 100K one on DraftKings today. And there is just no chance it goes anywhere. I don't have Michael Porter Jr., but I have Kemba Walker there with a juicy 24.25, as Lou Dort is apparently becoming the Campazzo of the night for me. He's going off in the second half of this honestly kind of entertaining game with Portland and OKC. I was watching it a little bit here, and they're two teams that aren't good, but I feel like something about the styles make the fights with this game that's going on right now.
The Thunder have been like oddly relevant in games this year. Like they're nearly 500. I have to check what their net rating is, but I feel like they play in a lot of close. This isn't really a close game. They're down by 16, except it's close enough that it's not over yet. But I do feel like there's been a lot of games they've been double-digit underdogs. They've either gone to overtime or just won outright this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something with the Thunder too, which I feel like it was might have been on the Dunked On podcast, which is one that our pal Josh Engelman put me on years ago. And it's been very insightful basketball podcast. Now they have a Prime membership that I don't pay for, but the free podcasts come out on Sundays and I enjoy those. And they were talking about the Thunder apparently lead the league in wide open 3-point attempts, which I think is interesting, and kind of what happens, I guess, when you have a team where there's no star and probably half the guys don't even want to shoot. But that's maybe why the Thunder make games a little more open-ended than it would seem, I guess, for a team that plays pretty slow.
Is that just the Lou Dort factor, where just teams are willing to just leave him wide open? Like, remember in the playoffs where he would have games where he had that one really big game, but other games against the Rockets, he would go like 2 of 8 from 3, and all of them would be wide open because they would just leave him open and dare him to shoot. Couldn't that be something that kind of skews the numbers? Because at least just based on the eye test, without looking into it too much, I feel like that's something that could be a factor.
I think that was what they were saying too, and I think it's sort of maybe the obvious joke to make, probably to a certain extent. But he's shooting 33% from 3 for the year, which is up about 3%. Like, I think he took that to heart. That was like a really embarrassing playoff effort for him, or whatever that was against the Rockets that last year, I think, where they just left him open and he missed 9 threes or whatever in that game win. And I think, to me, seems like he's improving, and his usage rate's been up this year in all the games when there's pretty much one Thunder star missing. So I like Dort. Dort's a guy I feel like is a scrappy underdog that I can get behind.
Yeah, I mean, Dort, in terms of defensive player, definitely is value. I've been making the case since the draft this year, because this was a pretty weak draft class. Like, there's a couple of players that are standouts. Like, obviously, LaMelo Ball's been really good. Halliburton's been really good, although nobody expected Halliburton to be this good prior to the draft. Edwards has come on a little bit lately. But I was saying before the draft, would you rather have the 4th overall pick in the draft without knowing who that player was going to be, or Lou Dort? Because Dort has a 4-year contract worth $5.1 or $5.5 million. And now you look at those players in the contracts, like, well, the Bulls ended up with Patrick Williams, who's on a rookie deal, which is fairly significant. The rookie deals are not cheap anymore. Would you rather have Patrick Williams and paying him like $7 million a year, whatever the numbers, or would you rather pay Lou Dort $1 million per year? I'd rather have Lou Dort. And that was something I was saying before the draft, where it's like, I think that in terms of how weak the draft was and the way the rookie scale is trending, I was like, I think I'd rather have Lou Dort than the 4th overall pick in the draft. And I think a lot of people thought that was like just a crazy asinine statement at the time. But then you actually compare the players now. Like, Lou Dort's better than most of the players that are in this year's draft class, and he gets paid almost nothing.
Yeah, you would like him to be a little bit more of a knockdown shooter, but I think the hope is that he can grow into that role of being like a 3-and-D guy. And I agree, getting those guys cheap is always going to be the move for team constructs. And that's sort of a real life basketball thing more than a DFS thing. But I agree, like Oklahoma City, it's hard to argue. I think enough people who are sharper than us in terms of the NBA cap constructs and all of that and the hoarding of draft picks, like Oklahoma City is building a team the right way. And they're winning way more than I think anybody would have guessed, and probably more than Sam Presti would want, because the picks are getting less valuable by the week as they keep hanging into this. Like, they're probably going to go to the play-in game or at least have a decent shot of getting there.
I don't think they'll get to the play-in game just because the West is so deep. I'll bring up the standings right now, but they are in 13th place right now, but ahead of them. So they would have to pass like 3 of the Pelicans, the Kings, and then either probably the Mavericks or the Grizzlies. Like, that's a pretty tall ask to pass 3 of those teams.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure also as the season goes on, you'll probably see less Horford, or maybe even gets traded in the trade deadline coming up. He's actually looked good. I feel like Horford revitalized the stock. Robert in the YouTube chat saying Josh's James Harden fade yesterday was hard to listen to. And this is something where, Josh and I disagreed on this one. I think for him too, when he realized that Awesemo was on the other side of James Harden, thinking he looked great yesterday, I think that hurt him a little bit, that hurt Josh. But the thing is, for all of DFS really, and you're using your data, you should be using the Awesemo data. You can get yourself at awesemo.com/join, but you got to make your stand somewhere. And, for me, I thought that did seem like a bit of a crazy take, and we could talk about Harden. We will talk about Harden probably a lot coming up here in a second, but it's all, it's all relative. And you could always kind of look back with hindsight and go like, oh, that was a terrible take. And I think it's the frustrating part sometimes about being on this side of things, where you're trying to talk through slates, you're trying to explain in a world of infinite possibilities how all these things could happen. And for Josh, not playing Harden made sense to him. And then in hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, what a dickhead that Josh is. And, and he is, but we love him for that.
I mean, that's also something that comes with the territory too, because, and also I did Blender's podcast there where we talked about DFS, and we mostly just talked about tilting for about an hour and a half today and talking about how we handle it differently, because he seems to, he takes it not necessarily more personally, but he, like, when people don't necessarily agree with his takes, or if somebody doesn't understand something he's saying, it really seems to get under his skin, where to me, I just kind of let it go. But that's also something that I think is so inevitable with the territory that we're in, is that if you give out takes, talk about the slates, say, these are the guys I'm playing, you're going to be wrong a ton. You're going to be right a ton too. And then hopefully over the course of time, like, I've been doing this, I quit my regular life job before I even got into content just to play DFS full time, like 6 years ago now. And so it's been a long time. I know that I'm profitable over the long haul at this point. I know that I make a good amount of money doing it, but I also know there's a ton of slates where I get my ass kicked. And I know that on all of those slates, I'm now talking about all the games. I'm talking about the players I roster. It is so inevitable that I'm going to have slates where I am on players who are not good. That's going to put other people who are on those same players as me that are not going to be good, and it's going to make them upset. So individually, I know it comes with the territory, and I know people are going to get mad at me from time to time. So the reason I don't get upset about it is because I already know that that's something that's going to happen.
I don't get upset about it either. And obviously, I've done content long enough, and outside of DFS too, dealing with the very hostile people that could sometimes come in different pockets of the internet that I've worked. And I would say that, I've learned to deal with it pretty well. But I think the worst part is that people really will sometimes get mad about the things that are wrong, or just even have a misinformed take. Like I got a little bit, not even heated, but just one dude was being a douche in the Live Before Lock show earlier. And I just went off, and it's like, look, I'm having a great couple weeks here. And I know because I see my DraftKings account and whatever, and I know like how it's been going, and I give out the exact plays every show I'm doing. And I'm like, hey, I'm heavy on this guy. I don't know how it's going to go, but we'll find out. So I feel like it just frustrates me when it's like, maybe people don't take the right things, or maybe it's just sort of, they don't like you as a person. They don't like the way you spin your money hat around. I don't know what it could be as common DFS hosts here, as we all do. But I just think it's interesting because, we've had former hosts here too, who I feel like had a very much a cult personality, where people really remember the successes and maybe don't remember the hits or remember the fails. And I think that's interesting. I think it's an interesting thing to note, and maybe that's why we need to just make sure everybody knows when we have good plays, really remind them every show.
Yeah, that's not really my strategy either. But what I do think is funny is I have my DMs open. I get the crazy influx of things that I get from people, ranging from people who the people are so bold when they DM me stuff. They'll just be like, I like you better than X analyst who's on the shows. People message me like, why do you keep doing the shows instead of Josh? I prefer when Josh is on the show. I'm like, thank you for letting me know. That is very much appreciated that you prefer that I'm replaced by somebody else. But it's really funny how people just DM you just random thoughts that are either very complimentary or very not complimentary. And they just have no issue telling you what they think.
Also, the right pick, and people, apparently one guy in chat's confused because we're not talking about it yet. Late slate starts, or the showdown slate starts in 40 minutes. So you are not under any sort of gun here. And here's the things: you're going to want to play James Harden. You're going to want to play Chris Paul. You're going to want to play probably DeAndre Ayton. I feel like that's basically it. Play those guys some configuration, and we can dig deep on it. But I think the right picks chat here is actually interesting. Talking about Fred VanVleet about to break the slate, and I think that's something that is actually important to note because this is something we talk about a lot on these shows. And if you're sort of trying to get your feet wet in DFS, trying to get better at it, it's the best way to think about it. Like, what happens when Kyle Lowry leaves the floor? And Lowry was playing great. Immediately, Fred VanVleet is getting more assists. Fred VanVleet's getting more possessions. Fred VanVleet's shooting more. Like, he was already having a pretty good day, but that's the difference between a good day and a great day. And I think that's something that maybe it's hard to talk about when we're doing a 10-game slate, when we're digging through a bunch of different things and trying to bounce around with whatever news is breaking and all that. But I think the example of like Kyle Lowry leaving the floor tonight is one. If you're watching that game, you're just paying attention to the middle, to the scores. Like, that's something that's important to note because that's DFS in a nutshell. This guy leaves, the other guy gets a million times better.
Yeah, and I'm gonna bring a betting tie into this too. There's a bunch of books that, number one, do live betting props, where like FanDuel DraftKings has up a lot of like points props for players during the games. So there's always things like if Kyle Lowry gets hurt during game, it seems like, oh, he's getting helped off the court. I always feel like a little bit of a dick that this is the way I think, but as soon as I see somebody get hurt while I'm watching a game, I always think, what are the live betting implications? And it's always like, all right, if Lowry gets hurt, that's obviously bad for the Raptors. So I go look to see if it looks like the live line's adjusted for it. And then I go look at the player props too, where there could be a deal where Fred VanVleet has like a 22.5 points prop or something like that. And you think like, all right, if we had known that Lowry was out before the game, that number would have been way higher. So I don't really like to live bet that much. I know a lot of people are really into it. I think it's safe to assume the lines are generally fair and adjust as the game goes on properly. But the one situation they don't is when players get in foul trouble or somebody gets hurt during a game. That's where I think that there's value in the live betting lines.
Yeah, I know our old pal Emac, who's in the chat, and I took over the show today for him because our team behind the scenes apparently didn't know that I was supposed to do it, and Emac was baffled as to what was going on. That happens when you get old, you just don't know. The senility hits. But Emac in the chat, we appreciate him, and make sure you're tuning into your old pal. I think he's back on this show on Friday night, and of course hanging out on the weekend, giving you guys the best content always on the weekends. Is your old pal Emac. Let's talk about the slate though, Greg, because I feel like we could start to dig in a little bit more here, and then we could take some questions. We can do all the stuff. But right now in the ownership, and hit the like button here, and I'll give you guys a little bit of a free preview of ownership. Just hit the likes as much as you can. We got 250 in here right now. Small but loyal community tuning into these late shows. So help us get that like number up. Get it up to 100 because I'm giving you guys some of the top owned players. James Harden projects to be 100% owned on DK, which I think is noteworthy. On FanDuel though, Greg, 99.9%. So you're getting a bit of a discount there. Do you feel like Harden's 100%? Because I agree that he's 100%. I would be inclined to get away from him at captain though.
I'm not inclined to get away from him at captain. I think you have to play him. I don't think you have to play him at captain, but at the same time too, I was building some lineups, and full disclosure, I only played one lineup for this slate, and I do have Harden in the captain spot. I tried to build other lineups, and I just didn't like him nearly as much without Harden in the captain spot. I understand that there's going to be a lot of overlap in ownership. Instead, I left some salary on the table. I think that offsets it a little bit. But still, I mean, the upside for Harden and the floor for him, there's no Kyrie Irving, there's no Kevin Durant. So we have to assume the usage for him is going to be ridiculous. We've seen, obviously not the situation with the Nets per se, but we have a large sample size of James Harden playing as the lone star on a team, whether it be when he was with the Rockets and Chris Paul was out, or when he was with the Rockets and Russell Westbrook was out. And we've seen his price tag get as high as 14,000 on FanDuel in that situation. We've seen him get over 13,000 on DraftKings. And I don't really think this is any different. It's not really an ideal matchup against the Suns. They have Chris Paul. They've been a good team this year, and they've definitely been better defensively than we've seen them in previous years. But I think just the role of James Harden, I don't really care about how chalk he is. And it's not like he's 100% owned a captain spot. He's 55% owned, and I still think it should probably be higher.
So I get that. And I think so there are two things I would point to here. One, I think you're right that he's going to be pretty close to an approximation of his Houston days. And it's been a small sample size without Kyrie, without Kevin Durant on the floor for James Harden, but 31.5% usage, 50% assist rate in the court time. And I think to me, that's the one thing that's different here is he's not taking the 50% usage you would sometimes have in games without Westbrook and Houston. It's a little bit lower. So you do see more value going to the other guys. You do see some shot creation still going on. I think, and that's sort of the one difference here, where in Houston, you're lucky if you had a good Eric Gordon game from here to there. Obviously, Westbrook would take some away, but in those days without Westbrook, like Gordon would gain a little bit, but Tucker isn't getting there much, or Covington, when he was on the Rockets, wasn't getting there much. And I do think there's more opportunity for these guys to have, some upside, because playing against Phoenix too, whose defense probably one of the best marks in the league. Actually, well, it's come down a little bit, I guess. They're a 107 defensive efficiency rating. They play slow though, so it's definitely going to be ugly. The shooting percentage they give up from the floor are also pretty ugly, only 35% from deep. But I just think that I don't know. I think Harden's not the exact same player, where I don't think he puts up 100 fantasy points today. Whereas in Houston, I think that you could actually be like, yeah, decent shot. He puts up 100.
So here's something else I think matters just from a game theory perspective. What does this game look like if Harden doesn't play well? If Harden doesn't have a big fantasy, if Harden doesn't have a big fantasy game, don't the Nets just get crushed in this game? Like, is there, obviously anything could happen, but in the most likely scenario, if Harden doesn't play well, I don't think that the starters play for either team in the fourth quarter. If Harden has a bad game, I think the Nets probably just got crushed by the Suns.
I mean, the thing with the Nets, though, and the way that they play is like, I think you're looking at probably a bunch of guys scoring like 8 points, and then maybe one guy like Jeff Green is the highest scorer that I'm going to make sure that's correct. Yeah, Jeff Green's the highest projected point scorer that I would have out of this group. So like, and that's 15 points. But then you have Joe Harris, I think gets 14-ish. Luau Cabro gets 11. I think you just want to have one of these guys have an outlier day, and then Harden puts up his usual 30 or so. But I agree. Like, there's probably a world where Harden puts up 40 or 50. I just don't think he's that dude. And I feel like he's kind of deliberately, kind of in the days similar to the days of Kobe, where he would sometimes just go like, oh, I'm shooting too much, huh? And just pass for an entire half. I think that's sort of the stage of Harden's career where he is, where everybody thinks he's the ISO ball guy. And now he's trying to show like, hey, I'm not the ISO ball guy. I can set up Jeff Green and Landry Shamet. And I feel like that's sort of what this game breaks down for him today.
All right. So let's look at it from this angle then. If you're not playing James Harden, a captain, let's rule out some. It's really, I was going to say let's rule out some of the higher owned options, but it's really just Harden because he's picking up 55% ownership. So if you play anybody who isn't Harden, a captain, for the sake of Showdown, you're differentiating yourself and you have a unique lineup for the most part. If you're rostering somebody who isn't James Harden, who do you think is the best captain play then?
So I think what you're trying to do for captain, and this is on DraftKings, on FanDuel, obviously it's going to be a little bit different there. You're not getting the markup on price and all those different wrinkles that are the unique to FanDuel with the single game format compared to DK's Showdown. But like, I have Harden having a 71%, and this is with the sim that I ran before the show. And this is obviously not, this is not Awesemo data. So the boom bust tool is going to be a whole separate thing. This is just how I do to run things real fast to get a quick look at it. Harden 71% chance to be top one. Then I have Booker at 12%, Paul at 9%, DeAndre Ayton at 7%, and DeAndre Jordan at 1%. And I think if you get, like, I think a DeAndre Jordan captain is appealing, Greg, because I know this is going to be a terrible way to start an argument, but with you do that, you're able to get into Harden, you're able to get Booker, you're able to get Paul, you're able to get Ayton. And I think you're taking a shot at some of the flotsam guys down below, the Dario Saric's, or I'm trying to think who, there was one guy at 3K, Landry Shamet. Like, I think to me, that's an appealing look, because I find it hard to believe based on how these teams look that you're not going to need the core 4 guys here. And Jordan to me looks like the best value. So that to me is what I would want to build around. And I think the way you get different with that, with all these guys who are going to be very highly owned and seem like locks to be in the top 6 players, like the way to do that is to not play Harden at captain.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about some of the upside of these other guys. And I think that there's a lot of guys that are mid-range plays that I think are viable for this contest, but I don't know what the upside is in a lot of them. Like, realistically, what's the ceiling? What's the ceiling like for Mikal Bridges? What's a ceiling game like for Jeff Green? Like, I think these guys could definitely have good games, but not enough to, I think, that they'd score enough to be in an optimal lineup from the captain spot. And then I look at, Chris Paul and Devin Booker, the two of them, when they have generally shared the court this year, they've hurt each other's production and upside because it's two very ball dominant players. Devin Booker has been nearly the same fantasy producer this year as he was last year. So just by the process of elimination, I think I'm getting to DeAndre Ayton as the best captain play who isn't James Harden. One thing about the Nets, it's kind of funny where it seems no matter who the Nets have had in their center rotation over the last 6 years or so, they've been terrible at defending centers for fantasy purposes. Like they've just gotten crushed by centers, no matter who it is they have for them. Now, DeAndre Jordan isn't a good defensive center at this point in his career anyway, but still, I mean, DeAndre Ayton, I think it's a pretty favorable matchup for him going up against DeAndre Jordan, and I feel a little bit better about his ceiling than I do about Devin Booker or Chris Paul's, just because Booker and Paul have cut into each other's production so much this year.
So you guessed my other captain here. And actually, we are at the halfway point of the show. So I got to wake Greg up, get the energy going. It's time to flip this cap round. It's money time, the most profitable time in DFS, of course. Hopefully. As long as you play Campazzo and you fade James Harden at captain, you'll be good to go. No, I think you're right. Ayton to me is also the other guy I would go to at captain. I might have swapped off and went to Booker at captain in my second lineup. But I do think going to one of those guys and not Paul would be the move. Paul's going to have the most ownership at captain on DraftKings. And I think there are some ways that the scoring could be easy enough and Paul isn't involved, where I did play, one of the lineups I had without Chris Paul, and I put in Mikal Bridges in the hopes that, hey, maybe the starting group gets there without Chris Paul doing a lot. I think if you pair it then too with one guy off the bench shooting well, I think there's some pathway here to get to a lineup without Chris Paul. But I do think Ayton, I agree, like he's going to get a lot of rebounds here. The usage is always kind of tricky for him. He's barely shooting over 10 shots a game more days than not recently, especially with Booker back in the mix. But Ayton's rebound ability and just getting some easy shots at the rim, like Whiteside is not a dude who did anything besides just get putbacks and get aggressive plays inside yesterday. And I do think Ayton's capable of it. So I think, to me, I'm with you that he would be an interesting captain play. I would take the Booker upside more, though. I think that's sort of the thing where if he puts up a monster scoring day here and then also sort of nerfs Chris Paul in that process, I think Booker's the most compelling captain to me besides Ayton. And then, Jordan is the value captain option.
All right, we've got some other news we could talk about here. We have the Nets starting lineup finally. It is not the starting lineup I would have guessed. James Harden, Tyler Johnson, and then we've got Bruce Brown, Joe Harris, and DeAndre Jordan. So Tyler Johnson, an unexpected starter. And let's talk about some late swap implications here, and then we could talk about this for DFS too. I don't even remember what Tyler Johnson's price tag was. I assume it was either the min or very close to the min now.
I still have him on this site, on this page rather. I have Tyler Johnson as 3,200 on DK.
That makes him a viable play to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Showdown, his price is Tyler Johnson is 2,400. So actually, yeah, I think with the minutes you're going to have here, he now is probably the preeminent value play, but also one that's going to be pretty highly owned, I would assume, if we get one more run of ownership before lock.
Yeah, and I mean, that was key for me because I had no clue who the Nets were going to start. I'm actually pretty surprised that Jeff Green isn't in the starting lineup. I was pretty convinced he was going to be a part of it. Obviously, that's not the case. I thought that Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot had a pretty good chance to start. That's not the case either. This is not the starting lineup I expected. DeAndre Jordan, James Harden, and I'll say Tyler Johnson. Those are probably my three favorite plays from the Nets for Showdown, without anything else considered until we get the ownership right now.
Yeah, so I just gave Tyler Johnson 10 more minutes and took 10 away from Jeff Green. Awesemo in the last run of data with the projections had Jeff Green getting 30, Tyler Johnson getting 18. So I feel like flipping that seems like the most logical way. Just get a quick look here. And I think that gives Tyler Johnson, it's actually a terrible projection for Tyler Johnson, to be clear, but 28 minutes would give him, for me, 18.6 fantasy points, which I think is useful. I don't know that I'd want to swap-timize him, though. Also, I don't have any room to swap-timize at all. So I think that's one thing to note. I didn't have enough dudes. If you have dudes, maybe worth getting Tyler Johnson in, but I don't think I have any room at all to get Tyler at all.
I have some exposure to like TLC, and I don't really have interest in him now, although I don't even know if that allows me the flexibility to get to Tyler Johnson. So see how that goes. Also, if a lot of these lineups are like Michael Porter Jr. lineups, like some of them I don't really give a care anyway. Like what am I doing? I'm making the time to swap a dead lineup to a slightly less dead lineup.
Let's see. Tyler Johnson at captain. What does that get you? If you put Tyler Johnson at captain, you can get Harden, Booker, Paul, Ayton, and Bridges. I don't know if that's that much better than getting Jordan. So
I'm pretty sure I just eyeballed the chalk lineup. It took like 5 seconds.
Let's see. What do you think it is? Because actually one of our guys, Brad, asked to build one. Tyler, could you pull up the DraftKings lineup page? Yeah, Tyler's going to pull it up now. We'll see. He asked if we could build the chalkiest lineup possible. And I think this actually might be a worthwhile exercise for this, just because it's a showdown. We won't normally do this.
Yeah. So, I mean, Harden at captain, that's the obvious, right?
Yes, that's the highest owned. That's the highest likelihood. So yeah, I think that's the first move there. So yeah, Tyler, put in Harden at captain whenever you get there.
Then it's Tyler Johnson is the value play.
Yep.
I'm doing it on my phone also as we go along, so I see the salary left over.
And then I think you're going Booker, Paul, Ayton, because they're sort of the three bigs.
Let's see if that works. Booker, Paul, Ayton. That leaves 2,600.
And then you get to Cameron Payne.
Is that the? I guess that probably is the chalk lineup.
Yeah, I think that would be my guess here, and because I don't think there's anything else you could really go down to either, and people won't leave that much money on the table, even though that would probably be the best move here. But yeah, because like Payne's back in, so Carter's going to be worthless. Jones, Galloway's not getting minutes. Maybe Nader, but yeah, I think people will go to Payne first and foremost.
Just eyeballing it, I'm pretty sure that's the lineup that like by pretty wide margin project for the most points too.
There we go. What is are we extending? Tyler's giving me hand gestures.
Yeah, I don't know. This is like when I was doing comedy and whoever was the headliner wasn't at the club yet, and I would just have the club promoter would show up and he'd start making hand signs and be like, "Am I supposed to stay on the stage longer? Or do I leave now? What am I supposed to do?" He's just in the back. He's giving me hand signals and stuff, and then somebody's mad at me when I get off stage. But yeah, that's a little bit how I feel like right now.
I think Tyler wants us to do the Macarena, is what I was guessing by this hand gesture.
Hokey pokey.
So Tyler, yeah, Harden at captain, then Tyler Johnson at utility, Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton, and Cameron Payne.
By the way, how good of a name is Campaign?
Oh, it's one of my favorites. I like that he's now like a good enough player to get back in the league. I follow the G League Twitter, and it's nice to see these guys sometimes bubble up where it's like, oh, Campaign at a monster day. And then when they're back in the league, it's like, oh, great to see Campaign's doing well. And now you know that he's good because he had 2 or 3 good games in the G League.
Yeah, it's like you helped him along his journey. You're invested in it at that point.
There was some players I was looking up. Oh, Sir Dominic Porter is a guy who had a nice G League day. And I was like, what's Sir Dominic up to? I remember that name. I don't remember anything about him. And guess he had a good day. He had like 7 boards and 29 points. So Sir Dominic, got to watch if he's in some garbage time rosters.
So let's talk about this slate from this angle too. So I'm going to bring up what do we have a latest run of ownership now or not yet?
Let's see. I will refresh. Boop, this is me doing boop, boop, boop. No, we don't have an ownership update.
Okay, because I was going to say, now that we have the starting lineup, let's try to figure out. We've identified the chalk. Good for us. Let's try to figure out who's a play that could make somebody money where you're not just splitting with a million other people. So who are some guys? And now we just kind of have to guesstimate the ownership a little bit. Who are some guys that you have projected well? Let's start with one sleeper from each the Nets and the Suns. So starting with the Nets, who is the player that you don't think will pick up ownership but has substantial upside? So, I mean, the guys who are going to get ownership, we know for sure, are going to be James Harden, DeAndre Jordan, and Tyler Johnson.
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, for the Nets side, I think it's just taking Tyler Johnson and hoping that he does something here. It's also a revenge game for Tyler Johnson. I know that everybody always loves that, but honestly, wouldn't shock me given Steve Nash. And, he's also playing in Phoenix too, or coaching in Phoenix. And maybe there's a little bit of, we all know the Suns, huh? Get back out there, Tyler. This is my Steve Nash impression. I've really been working on hard. but I think like besides that, like who else is really going to get the run? I think Luau Cabarro would still be the other guy I would consider, but Tyler, to me, just taking that, especially at his price on Showdown, I feel like Tyler's the obvious one for the Nets that you just have to take.
But
maybe Shamet too. I could throw in the mix, but I feel much more confident in Tyler.
So let me rephrase the player that people aren't going to be on relative to Showdown. Because I mean, Tyler Johnson's going to be like 50, 60% owned. So which guy do you think that won't have ownership has potential upside? I'll go. I think it's TLC because he's somebody who I thought was going to start, now isn't starting, but still, I wouldn't be shocked if TLC ends up closing the game. I don't think the starting lineup dictates what the closing lineup is going to be for the Nets as well, especially not if it's a blowout, because then who knows what the closing lineup is going to be. But TLC is, I think, the guy who's not in the starting lineup is the best chance to close the game, and that would give him some upside.
I would think it's probably still Luau Cabarro. The issue for me is that in the the run of ownership we had before Tyler Johnson was announced as a starter, Luau Cabarro had 32%, and at his price point, I don't know that comes down that much, especially if we're assuming that Green kind of gets less minutes in the process, and then perhaps Luau Cabarro's minutes stay flat. Actually, let's see if Awesemo updated his minutes outlook, because this could be insightful. No, not yet. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like TLC may just have enough ownership left over, because are people going to be paying that close attention at this point would be my other question. And I think at that point, I would go Shamit. I feel like Shamit's 25% now. He's now also not starting. I think that probably gets him to 15-ish or maybe 20-ish even. And that's probably the lowest own you're going to get for, I think, the Nets side. That's actually got some potential to be useful.
Yeah, I think that's all reasonable. Yeah, I'm pretty surprised by the Nets starting lineup. It's definitely not what I expected. And then I am curious to see if we get a run of ownership before the slate starts, to see how much it's reflected in the starting lineup change. Or like you said, is it just that, hey, it's 10:10 p.m. Eastern time, and do people maybe just not care as much at this point in the day? So let's see what that looks like. And then same question for the Suns. Which player do you think that isn't one of the chalk players from Phoenix has a chance, or has the best chance to end up in the optimal lineup?
So for me, I think this one is a little more obvious in terms of how I'm projecting it, but I think Dario Saric is the one that I would want to get to in terms of just a cheap player. I think Campaign honestly should probably be a little bit more in play for me, but he's just 2 fantasy points lower in my projection, and I think that's the difference for me with Payne. But the Payne really, like, especially if you see, I don't know, Chris Paul suffers a little bit in that first unit, maybe Payne gets hot in the second unit, and then just shaves a few minutes off of Paul where it makes it tough for him to get there. Not that Paul's going to ever have a bad day necessarily, but for Showdown, you're still just trying to get what opens up the right optimal construction. And I think Payne or Saric would be it, but Saric would be my lean. What about you?
I'm a little tempted to say Jay Crowder, just because I think that he's good, but he's also pretty expensive, 5,400. So I think that kind of precludes him. I think the right answer is Saric. I just don't want to say him because you just said him. How about Mikal Bridges? I understand he's at 30% now, but now that we have Tyler Johnson starting at such a cheap price, I think that's going to cause people to just jam in Harden, Ayton, Paul, and Booker all together. And I think that could cause the ownership on Mikal Bridges to drop a little bit. I mean, 7,400 is a little pricey to pay for him, but still, for a showdown slate, we're talking about a starter, obviously in a really favorable matchup against the Nets. He's been very good overall this year. So I think that he is somebody who could get pinched a little bit in the ownership now that it's easier to go stars and scrubs and just fit all the top guys in.
Yeah, I think Mikal Bridges is definitely one guy who fits. Sometimes it is the way you get different is finding one of the cheap dart throw guys and hoping they go off with low ownership. But for the most part, it does seem like the cheap dart throw guys who have a pathway to actually being useful. That was a tough one. It's almost as tough as a late slate sweat and swap. We got to keep practicing, and they all come out right. I feel like in terms of the dart throws, like they're all going to be mostly appropriately owned, but maybe Bridges, like I do think there's a pathway here where it's probably honestly more Booker that fails if Bridges gets hot, because thinking about it more, Chris Paul dominates that ball so much and sets guys up. Maybe not playing Booker is the way. Then you see the scoring come from Ayton more. You see the scoring come from Bridges, maybe even see the scoring come from Saric in that second unit, or Crowder. Really, you can make that case. But I think if you're not playing Booker, you should probably load up on multiple Suns, because that to me is the obvious pathway. This game, A, blows out, and then B, just has Booker not get to where he needs to.
Yeah. By the way, I'm looking at my swap options. It's really funny. Like if I wanted to take TLC out of my DraftKings lineups, it's the choice is because of the position he's at. It's either Each-One Moore or Abdul Nader, and it's like, all right, so I guess we're just sticking with TLC.
I don't think I have any. Actually, I do have a little Luwawu Cabro. Let's see where I have him. I have one Luwawu Cabro lineup, which conveniently also has RJ Hampton with his 9 fantasy points. So pointless lineup either way. But yeah, I can't get to Tyler Johnson there. I could get to, let's see. I could get to Each-One Moore, as you said. I could get to Cam Johnson, who also doesn't play anymore. So yeah, probably ride it out with TLC would be the move. Yeah,
well, very exciting options. I could also, I have a Shamit. I have one Shamit lineup that I could swap to Tyler Johnson, which I'm sure the rest of the lineup sucks anyway, and it's not going to matter. But I'm going ahead and making that swap.
Whenever you can get a little Tyler Johnson in your life, like the thing for me to get into Tyler Johnson would be, do I want to just trade in my James Harden lineups for Tyler Johnson? And I'm going to say that's probably a no.
No, I still have. I mean, I'll have to do the math right here, but I'm still going to have, James Harden. Yeah, he looks like he's a good, 40 some fantasy points projected better than Tyler Johnson.
Yeah, leave the 8K on the table. That's how you get different when you're swapping.
That's definitely be unique if you do that.
If you had to fade one of the big three from Phoenix or come appreciably under their ownership, and I honestly would expect these guys to come up a little bit more with the value in Tyler Johnson, but in the most recent run of ownership we had Booker getting 60% overall. This includes the captain and the utility. Chris Paul getting 70%, DeAndre Ayton getting 61%. Relative to that ownership on DraftKings, Greg, which guy would you feel like you'd want to come under the most on?
Still probably Booker. I think with Booker on the whole this year, also he's 600, he's 9,600. We have Chris Paul at 9,000, DeAndre at 8,400. So he's the most expensive of the three. And overall for the season, I'm going to double check this to be sure. I'm pretty sure that Chris Paul has been the better fantasy producer than Devin Booker for the year. We have Chris Paul this year averages 38 fantasy points. Devin Booker averages, pretty sure it's less than that.
I mean, Paul's at 1.2 per minute rounded up, and Booker's at 1.06.
Yeah, so Paul averages a whopping 1 fantasy point more about per game, but there's still the difference also that Devin Booker is a decent amount more expensive, and that's $600. It matters a decent amount for Showdown. I think one thing I would be willing to do, I have Chris Paul project for more fantasy points on this slate. I would be willing to differentiate yourself. If you're in a spot where you have $9,600 left and you're choosing between Chris Paul and Devin Booker, if you go to Chris Paul, you're going to have a much more unique lineup if it leaves that $600 on the table just because he's cheaper and people don't like to leave salary on the table. And like I said, I have Chris Paul project for more fantasy points than Booker anyway.
Normally for regular slates, you don't want to do that in NBA. Like for NFL, that's usually fine, or at least a decent enough approach. But for NBA, normally you're trying to get, I've been shouting out this column too much, but our boy Alhambro does a good lineup review column every day for Awesemo, where he points out like the percentage of lineups finishing in cash and the cash lines in DK's top tournaments, and then how much salary they're using. And it's always 50,000, always 49.9, 49.8, and then it drops off a cliff after that. So for the most part, for main slates, you're trying to do that. But I agree on this slate, if you were to just have a lineup where Booker looks good and you're also pretty close to the salary and just leave them out and go to Paul, that definitely gets different right away. And I think that actually wouldn't shock me if that were the winning combination. By
the way, we have a different starting lineup than normal for the Phoenix Suns.
I just saw that.
Yeah, so they are starting Jay Crowder back in the starting lineup over Frank Kaminsky, who Frank Kaminsky, for a player who isn't good, he's gotten a whole lot of chances in the NBA. Teams keep throwing him out there, and they're like, yeah, maybe we'll be the team that Frank Kaminsky starting makes sense for. And 0 for a few on those attempts. But yeah, we've got Jay Crowder back in the starting lineup over Frank Kaminsky. So that does make Crowder now more of an interesting option to me. At least the latest run of ownership, Crowder was correct for 21%. In terms of a showdown slate, that's pretty low for a starting player.
Yeah, I kind of don't love that for Saric either, who looked like pretty good value, but now he's going to have Kaminsky, who has been shooting a lot. And actually both Saric and Kaminsky have been, Saric on the year has been a 26% usage guy. Kaminsky's been 19%. And I think Kaminsky's okay when you have like one guy out in the starting lineup, but he's clearly been lost a little bit with Booker back in there. I think though, this kind of makes Saric and Kaminsky, I wouldn't say takes them out of play, but I kind of feel like those guys do the same thing. Like they both are going to chuck and try to do some peripheral things, but probably not do much well. And I feel like that's not great to have together in the same group.
Well, also one of them probably gets pinched. I think that I think it's probably going to be Kaminsky just because he started the year with such a minimal role when this team was healthy, and they have everybody back now. And Jay Crowder, who came back, and I think it was a hamstring injury he was dealing with, and he played limited minutes for a little bit. He was coming off the bench. Now he's back in the starting lineup. If we go back to Kaminsky's role before he was starting, the 3 games prior, he played 8 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 15 minutes, and 17 minutes. And then earlier in the season, he was playing under 10 minutes per game. So I wouldn't be shocked to see Kaminsky kind of get squeezed from the rotation here. Not to the point where he's all the way out of it, but I think if we see Kaminsky play like 8 to 12 minutes, that wouldn't be surprising either.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good point there. And definitely a more crowded Suns lineup that we've seen recently, where they were pretty shorthanded for a while. Now they got pretty much everybody back, and looks like they have about 10 guys expected to get minutes by Awesemo. So that's not the best combination for DFS normally. Whereas the Nets, at least we know they have less guys, even if they're all crap.
Yeah, I mean and not only do the Suns have all these guys, but they've randomly switched up the rotation for really no reason. Like, remember there was a Javon Carter slate where he was like 25% owned on DraftKings, just literally wasn't in the rotation that night. He came in garbage time to play the final 3 minutes of the game. But there's been times where they've just mixed up the rotation. So I mean, yeah, like we could see Twan Moore fall out. We could see Kaminsky could fall out. We could see somebody like Langston Galloway's randomly entered the rotation at times, Javon Carter. So in terms of the back end of the rotation, there's definitely some variables with the minutes.
Is there anybody that you, and actually, let's see, let me just check ownership one more time and see. We did get the minutes updated from Awesemo, so that was an important one. If you guys are trying to do any swap optimizing, if you somehow have the roster space to do it, or if you just want to build some better showdown projections, check that out now because it's all been updated. Trying to think if there's anybody that you feel like is going to be lower owned. It's hard to get a perfect read on it, but with this moving around, I feel like Kaminsky now drops off a cliff entirely. And I agree that there probably is a minutes pinch here, and Kaminsky could easily lose minutes to Saric, and then Saric is just, the guy who takes a spot in the rotation. But I do think taking a stab at Kaminsky with him coming down would be interesting. I think Crowder starting is probably the most interesting move. I think especially in a lineup without Booker. But do you have any feel here for a guy who's probably going to drop as a result of all of this that could be useful?
I have an opinion on guys who could drop that won't be useful.
Close enough, I guess.
Yeah. I guess this probably still, no, not really, actually. I don't think this changes a whole bunch other than me saying that Jay Crowder, I thought was kind of a fringy option. Now I think that he's more viable. And then I think Kaminsky was probably a fringe option who's no longer viable. That's how I would view it personally.
JEW in the premium Slack. We'll take a couple questions here. Who's your favorite low-owned Gentile for Showdown? He loves to lead into his chosen status, and I appreciate that about him. Shamit or TLC over Tyler Johnson? He asks, would you go Shamit or TLC over Tyler? I feel like I would just take Tyler for the same reasons we would have taken Campazzo today, where at least we know the minutes will be there and you can spin the revenge narrative a little, but there's got to be somebody who shoots a little bit more in that first unit. So I would still go Tyler, but I would still think if I'm not going Tyler, I guess Shamit, but I don't love it really.
Tyler's the preferred option. If you're just going for ownership, though, I'd go TLC over Shamit. Shamit's so reliant on making 3-pointers to get fantasy stats, and he doesn't really do a whole lot else. At least TLC at times this year, we've seen him, rack up steals. He can get rebounds. So he'd be a slight lean there. For sure, Tyler Johnson is the preferred option of that trio, though.
Yeah, I wonder if it's maybe getting too cute, and if you're trying to perhaps get different in a some other way than leaving out Tyler Johnson. But actually, I did make one lineup without Tyler Johnson, and I just kind of edited the two that I had already made and hand built, and I'm leaving $600 on the table in both because I think that's the construction that makes sense to me to get different with. And still no hard-net captain, Greg. I won't do it no matter what you tell me.
All right, your loss. That'll be your $15 Showdown entry down the drain.
I'll never get it back. That's how it always goes. We got a question here in the YouTube chat from Jacob Kimball, one of our regulars. Crowder or Bridges, he asks. And I think based on the ownership and the fact that Crowder wasn't a known starter until, about 5-10 minutes ago, I would go to Crowder now. Bridges ownership isn't too onerous either, but Crowder, I think, projects a little better in terms of value. And I just feel like more comfortable for that one, Greg. But how do you feel about it, Crowder or what was the other one? Crowder or Bridges?
So it depends what we're talking about here, because you reshuffling your entire lineup, because there's a big gap between the two of them in terms of price. And even so, I'll just read this off. So in Alex's latest projections, he has Bridges projected for 28 fantasy points and Crowder projected for 21. So given that big of a gap in projection between the two, it's hard for me to say that you want to leave that salary on the table unless you're spending up elsewhere.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Crowder, just people are not paying enough attention at this point of the night. And I think especially with one game left. So just getting a guy who's starting and, should theoretically see a starter's minutes, I think is probably worthwhile because nobody just knew that was going to be the case, a couple hours ago. Any other last minute questions here? You guys got about 7 minutes left to lock. And honestly, the ownership elves may have just given up for the day if I had to guess.
Let's see. How about this? I'm just going to throw a lineup in with Crowder at captain.
Oh God. I mean, if you're doing that one, I definitely would not play Booker. I feel like he draws away from Booker the most because it's just, basically another guy getting set up by Chris Paul. Yeah.
Well, the issue is that if you don't play Booker, then you're just leaving a ton of salary on the table. Like if you commit to Jay Crowder at captain, it was a pretty ugly looking lineup.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, I guess Booker's floor is high enough. Like really the ideal guys you're getting in whenever you can afford it are going to be Harden, Paul, Ayton, and Booker. I don't think that's anything surprising. Are you a believer in DeAndre Jordan, by the way, given the fact that, there is another big going there? We did see him yesterday matching up against Whiteside because he's going to be pretty highly owned. He's actually almost as highly owned as Booker relative to the overall utility.
Well, I think he's pretty clearly the best play of the guys who isn't one of the stars. If we're not considering ownership, just because he is somebody who, and we've talked about this a few times with DeAndre Jordan this year, as much as he isn't a good real life fantasy producer and a good real life producer anymore, he's still a pretty good fantasy producer. And he is scoring, let's see, right around a fantasy point per minute this year, 21.4 minutes per game, 21.3 DraftKings points per game. So, and then we consider the matchup against DeAndre Ayton. Like if they don't have Jordan in to defend DeAndre Ayton those minutes, who is guarding DeAndre Ayton? Like, are they really going to just have like Jeff Green on him? Right? Like I think they're going to have to extend the minutes for DeAndre Jordan in this matchup.
We also just got an ownership update. So thank you to the folks behind the scenes who are always working tirelessly, even when the days never end. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast here. But Tyler Johnson on DK, we'll give you guys this for free because we appreciate you guys watching this show, a new show here, especially on a day where there's only one game. Tyler Johnson on FanDuel projects for 18% ownership, which I guess you could see with the differences in FanDuel and all that. Tyler Johnson, though, still only 29%. Jay Crowder up to 37%, and Mikal Bridges up to 40% overall ownership for the possession or for those positions. So Tyler, it doesn't seem like our team is predicting them that they'll be as chalky as he probably would normally be in a slate like this.
Well, there goes my idea. Because what I thought was going to happen is I thought people were going to get off Bridges and go stars and scrubs. And now it looks like people are not doing that. So yeah, I mean, if that's the case, then Tyler Johnson's a really strong play. People just aren't rostering him.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised by that being that low because normally I feel like it would cram in, but we try to account for everything. Our team does try to account for everything here ownership wise. And I think honestly, people just not paying close enough attention as the night ends. There's still edges to be found. Unfortunately, it requires you playing DFS every minute of your waking day, but there's still some edges to be found, Greg.
Yeah, you just have to stay up all night. You have to sweat out the Nets starting lineup. You really got to pay attention. Like, oh, the Nets starting Timothy Luwawu-Cabarrot or Tyler Johnson. This is where the true edges are found. Is 4 minutes before the 10. Why is there even a 10:30 game? Like, there's such a weird gap in between games today. Where that's the other thing too. We're talking about what's the status for lineups. I don't know. James Harden's like my highest owned player today, and his game doesn't end until like 1 a.m. my time.
Is like TNT playing? Is this like the late game on a doubleheader? I presume that would be why, but honestly, I wasn't watching.
Nobody knows. The world's greatest scholars have spent all day trying to figure this out. Nobody knows why they did it this way.
See, because of Tyler Johnson being solo owned, I was going to go with one lineup with him and one lineup out without him. And now I'm going to try to put him in both. And I was flirting with the idea of going Harden at captain, but I just can't get there. I just feel like it just feels dirty to get there.
Yeah, I'm so surprised by Tyler Johnson's ownership.
Yeah, if it stays that low, I mean, he's certainly the best value overall on the slate. Even if he bombs out, like it's 2,400 for a guy getting starter minutes. It's just too much.
I like how you're saying like, stays that low. I mean, the slate locks in 2 minutes. Like how much is going to change before then?
I mean, you never know if like it's just going to be higher because our team was expecting it to go one way and then ended up being a little bit different.
One thing that's also really funny about Showdown slates is if your ownership is off, like projected on one player, by default, it's off so much on everybody because there's only so many viable options.
People mad that the Lakers didn't play THT at all today, by the way, which I think is funny. I guess that's not been the way it's gone, but that's what happens when you try to bank too much on a fringe rotational guy.
I mean, I've fallen for the Taylor Horton Tucker trap more than once this year. Luckily, tonight was not one of those times. By the way, that's not true. He just scored 0 fantasy points.
Oh, good. Even better than for all the THT fans. He just decided to completely let you all down and not even try.
He played 6 minutes. He went 0 of 2 from the field and had no other stats.
Yikes. Not a great game. That Lakers game, I think people wanted to be a good fantasy game overall. And I wasn't getting anybody projecting too well in that one. And I guess maybe other than Schroeder, I think had a pretty decent day. I haven't checked in the last hour, but
LeBron had a good game.
Okay. I had him and I feel like he's probably not killing me. I assume based on what I'm saying.
LeBron had 30, 13, and 7. Anthony Edwards had a big game, and Jared Vanderbilt had a pretty big game. He had 4 points, 13 rebounds, and a couple of steals. So at least pretty good relative to his near min price tag on FanDuel.
All right, we're about 1 minute away from lock here. So thanks to all you guys for tuning in, and come back around this time. It'll always be 1 hour before either the Showdown locks if there's a big tournament, or whenever there's a full normal late slate. That's when the show will be. So make sure to subscribe to the channel too, because we are doing this now. It's going to be every day, or every weekday rather. And I will be here, at least for now, every day, making sure that we are having a great time with all of you guys. Greg, any final words here, or plugs, or really any rants, anything in your heart you want to give to the people?
Yeah, this isn't your fault, but the schedule mix-up, like I had promoted the show. I was all excited that I had that tweet about EMAC where I was like, good, I'm doing the show with EMAC. I'm going to promote it. I compared him to an old turtle. And then I find out today I'm not even doing the show. So I fired off the tweet at the wrong time.
And the good news is you're building EMAC's brand, and that's what he cares about more than anything.
Yeah, that's definitely what EMAC's all about, is the branding, because he needs everybody to come watch. And by the way, this is so far past his bedtime anyway. Is he watching the show? That would also be really weird if he was just in the chat the entire time after saying he couldn't show up.
No, he was in the chat briefly. I think he said he was doing hockey lineups, then going to bed. He had a big presentation at work. EMAC's got you only have so many hours in your life when you get to that age.
Yeah, I feel like his presentations, that has to be like a kid doing a book report when you didn't read the book. That's how I feel. That's how I feel EMAC doing a presentation at work.
EMAC's doing a little presentation on Matilda for his job. All right, we'll be back tomorrow. Follow at Chris Spags. Follow at G Ehrenberg DFS. Greg's got lots of great tweets all day, and it'll be me and Greg again tomorrow after Greg does a regular live before lock. I'll be on the tip-off with Kayla and our pal Eric Lindquist, the other Eric, the younger, more vibrant Eric. He'll be on that show. So see you guys then. Enjoy your nights, and good luck.